In lesson 7, we're going to talk about layer organization. And the best thing I have for this is what not to do with your layers. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to pull out this flyout menu here of this layers. And I'm just going to put it right here. And I'm going to make it a lot bigger so you can see all of the layers that went into this image. Okay. This is an old composite that I did from years ago. One of the things that I used to do, and actually how I got into photography, was because I was building these composites. It was a great practice for me because I got to know how to use Photoshop very well by picking it apart. However, if you look here, this layers palette is a nightmare. How many layers do we have here? I mean, and are they labeled? No, they're like, layer 39. Okay, well, what does layer 39 do? I don't know. Let's turn it on up and see. Oh, layer 39 looks like it's a reflection on the window. So why wouldn't I just call it reflection on the window? Okay, these are the things that we need to get in better practices when we're organizing our layers. Now, you might not get to a point where you're making a 60 or 70 layer based image like you see something like this. There are at least 40 layers that have been built on this image to make this image what it is. And that's not even including this outer area here. This right here was about 15 to 40 layers by itself, because each one of these things is a different picture that's building this. Every one of those nuts I took a picture of. This was all stock photography. It was like I said, it was a great practice for me to A, get out with my camera and find things almost like a scavenger hunt, and B, put them together into a composite. So the idea behind this composite was really just to show what would happen, in the year 3080 when these like giant turtle spaceships were destroying the planet. And really what it is like, if you look right here, this is the top of, I think, like the planetarium in San Francisco, or there's some place there that we used to go to, the Science Center. This is the top of the Science Center in San Francisco. These are some butterfly wings on a turtle shell with a rhino head. Just really crazy things. It just made it really fun. I'm sharing this with you. It's a very small image. And the reason why it's small is that if I were to give you the large size PSD document, number one, I'd be giving you all my work. And number two, it would be a huge, huge file. Too big to give to you in this course. So I made it very small just so that we can look at the practice of the layers and layer organization. So when I look at these layers here, let's just start turning things off. We can see that all of these areas back here basically deal with that background area. So a couple things that I could do here, this was obviously just a buildup of things that I did to make it look like outer space back there. So you see, if I press Alt or Option and click on a visible layer, this is a texture or something that I made blue that looked like outer space. This is a black layer to subdue that color on there. This is what looks like maybe a high pass filter or something like that. And this is, again, building up the exterior or the outside of what this would look like. So I'm going to turn all these layers back on, and you can just click and drag up and it will turn all of those layers back on. So if I go down here and I look at this, I can either start renaming this. I could rename this background. And all you have to do to rename it is double click on the text, background, and then back BKG modifier, and just get into the habit of looking at these layers and seeing what they do. This is BKG mod 2. Or, just to make it easier on myself, I could click all of these, the bottom through here, press and hold Shift and click on them, and press Command or Control G. That puts them into a group. So I can double click on that group and call that group background. So now, if I turn that background group off, it turns everything off that's back in that background area. Then if I were to look at things like this is a hue saturation adjustment layer. This hue saturation adjustment layer probably should be in this background folder at the very top. And if I need to, I can just click and drag it and drop it right into that background folder until it's underneath the folder. So that's all of that background layer. Then if I look at these layers, that's the moon, that's the earth, and then here we have some explosions that are happening there. And then there's one of my turtles. Okay, so what I could do here is I could take all of this area, press the Shift key and click on the moon, press Command or Control G, and call this Moon Earth. Turn that layer on and off, and that's the moon and the earth. Okay, let's get this all back. This is a nice little layer that makes it look like the Earth is exploding from being shot by this giant turtle thing. So then if I start clicking through these layers and turn the visibility on and off, I can start to see what was the turtles. So these are all the turtles. So if I click and press and hold shift and click on the top one, Command or Control G, I can then double click on this and call this turtles. Turn these eyeballs off just to see what this is. This all looks like the explosions. So I can take these explosions, put these together. And these all look like the explosions and the things that are happening, like the reflections and stuff that are happening on the window itself. So I can then take all these and put them into a group and just press Command or Control G and maybe call this Windows and Explosions. So why am I showing you this? Well, I'm showing you this because now my layers palette is much cleaner. If I just want to see what's on the outside of that window area and deal with that stuff, I can. All of this stuff makes up those windows in that window area. It looks like we have some areas here too that deal with what looks like the glass that's happening on there too. It looks like these can all go maybe into that glass and window and explosion area too, because they were a little high up there. So I'll open up this group. I'll drag them and drop them right onto the top. They can go in there as well, because they're all part of the windows and the explosions. I didn't know that because I didn't have everything basically in a good, proper order. Now when I turn all this off, it's going to turn off all of the things that are inside that center circle, where they should be. This is my outside layer. You can see I've got some other explosion area here that is basically being covered up by this window facade that I've built. But the main thing I want you to get at there is that you can start grouping your layers and putting things into groups so that you can turn them on and off as a whole group rather than having this smorgasbord of crap all over the place. It really is a nightmare of a layers palette. So now one of the other things I want to show you is right up here, where you see where this thing that says kind. This is a way that you can search for very specific layers in your image. Now notice that we put these into groups. We put them into groups very tediously because I want to show you what happens when we start to organize things. If you look at this and you hover over it, it's going to say filter for pixel layers. If I click this, it's going to show me everything in here that is a pixel based layer. Notice how it doesn't have any adjustment layers in here, nor does it have my groups. It's okay. It's just temporarily showing me what all my pixel based layers are without moving anything. It's just filtering all my pixel based layers. If I turn this off, it's going to get back to the layer organization that I had. If we click this one, this is going to show me any of my adjustment layers that are happening. Remember, the adjustment layers are any of those layers that expand outside of the realm of a pixel-based layer or a vector-based layer like text. This next one over is a text-based layer. Any one of these, if I click on this, it's going to show me all of the text in my image. So when we have an image like this, let's just turn that text off. It's got a lot of different things going on, and we're saying, you know, all I need to do right now is to just see my text. That's all I want to do. If all I want to do is see my text, I just hit this layer here, and it shows me all of the text-based layers that are happening in my layer stack. This next one over will filter for shapes. I don't have any shapes in here, so you won't see any. And this next layer over here will filter for smart objects, and I don't have any, so that's not going to happen either. We can get very specific about it though. This is just being very generic by saying just pixel layers or just adjustment layers or just vector based layers, which would be this text and shapes. But what happens if we want to get even more specific? Well, let's do it by name. If we filter by name, let's just filter for moon. I want to know where that moon layer is. Well, there it is. Look, it's in this folder called Moon Earth, and right there is the moon. So that way I know that if, okay, that moon right there, I need to do something to that moon. Something to that moon to make it just less. So I'll just drop the opacity on there a little bit better so it blends in with that background a little bit more. So that was very easy for me to find that moon instead of having to search through my layers palette. That's why we have to name our layers, because at any time we can do a search for our layers based on the name. If we were to do a search on our layer based on effect, we have bevel and emboss. We have strokes. Anything that has a bevel and emboss, like this glass has a bevel around it to show beveled glass, it's going to break down our attribute of the layer styles that would have a bevel and emboss in it. If we go by mode, by blend modes, We can look up even any layers that are based off of very specific blend modes. So here we're seeing any layers that are using the overlay blend mode, or any layers that are using the soft light blend mode, which we don't have, or any layers that are using the color dodge blend mode. Here we can go by attribute. Is it visible? Let's just show me all of the visible layers, or show me all the locked layers. We don't have any locked layers, so it's not going to show us any. But this can be one of those things where sometimes we accidentally will lock a layer and we're like, oh crap, which layer did I just lock? Well, here you can filter it by the attribute of being locked, being empty. So here we do have some empty layers. What's in these empty layers? Nothing. These layers are empty. They have nothing in them. So if I even delete them from here, just drag them right to the trash, it's not even going to change my image. I actually had empty layers on here that were doing nothing to my photograph. Empty. Let's look at linked. Are there any layers in here that are linked? No. Are there any layers in here that are clipped? Yes. These are clipped layers or clipping masks. So when we talk about things like linked layers and clipping masks, if, for instance, I wanted to make sure that this text right here, that's Apollo 3080, and this text right here, In Search of a New Utopia, if these two layers need to move together, we can do that by clicking on one layer, control and clicking on another layer, right-clicking on them, and then going to link layers. So now what happens is if I move these layers, they will move together. See that? They're moving together and not independent of each other because they're linked. Even though they're so far apart on the layers palette, there's even a layer in between them, they can still move together independently around the image even though they aren't directly on top of one another, because we've told Photoshop, link these two layers together. These layers, like insert this one right here, it says In Search of a New Utopia. Let's say if I just grab this and its levels adjustment, and well, what's happening with this is these are clipping layers. So this levels adjustment is being clipped into that In Search of a New Utopia, and this layer 13 is being clipped into there too. So if I take all three of these and move them even down to here, let's say, okay, and then if I click on this Apollo 3080 and press V for the move tool and move it around, they are still linked together. That is the attribute of linked layers working together, so that anytime I move either this layer or this layer, they move together because they're linked. Another one of the attributes that I didn't even tell you about yet is the clipping mask. What's happening here, this texture is being clipped into this In Search of a New Utopia text. So right now they weren't linked. If I move this down, this is on top of that In Search of a New Utopia now. If I press Alt or Option and click on that layer 13, what that's doing is that layer 13 is clipping itself into that In Search of a New Utopia. So it's basically stealing all of the text properties of the term In Search of a New Utopia and filling in that text with that whole texture. So this is, instead of using a mask or something like that, this is called a clipping mask. This clipping mask allows this layer right here to steal all of the attributes of the text layer that it's clipped into. It's a great way for you to put one layer into another layer, specifically with text, so that that texture will not exist outside the bounds of that text or that vector-based area. If I wanted that to stay in that area there, this is In Search of a New Utopia, I would have to make sure that I have all of these layers linked. If I right click and say link layers, now when I move these, they will all move together with the texture applied to it, and they're still moving with this Apollo 3080. Now, if I look at my attributes here and I go to attribute and say linked, this will show me all of the layers that are linked together. Now it's going to show me any layers that are linked, period. But here it'd be really easy for me to break those links by right-clicking on and saying, you know what, I'm going to unlink this layer. And then it unlinks those layers so they're no longer linked. So it's no longer linked as an attribute to that In Search of a New Utopia layer. So what this does, it really just gives you a good way of finding all of the different types of layers in your image and making sure that you select the one that you actually need. Whether that's based on typing the actual name of it, like when we type just to find the moon, we just need to find the moon. So when we type moon, we found the moon. But that's because I labeled that as moon. If I didn't label it as moon, I never would have found it by typing moon in. That's why I want you to get in the habit of naming all of your layers so that you can find them easier. When it comes to really big images, the most important thing to be efficient and proficient in Photoshop is to ensure that you're working on a clean layers palette and not have mess all over the place like you see in this old composite that I did from ages ago where I didn't know how to make layer groups and I didn't know how to organize my layers in an effective way. Notice I was still able to make an effective piece, but the layer organization was just all over the place. That would be kind of like me owning a Ferrari and you seeing this beautiful car on the outside. You're like, man, Blake, you must be real sharp. And you open it and there's trash everywhere. It's the same thing. You got a nice composite, but when you open up the hood on that thing or you open up the doors and there's empty Yoo-hoo bottles and trash all over the place, it's a mess. You think I'm crazy. My best friend back in high school had an Acura Integra, all souped up, beautiful paint job on the outside. The place was a mess on the inside. I couldn't even sit in his car. So you want to make sure that the outside matches the inside, so to speak. Get those layers organized beautifully. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about merging layers, which is really helpful to understand before we get into things like saving our images.